In Jacksonville's Seminole Park, there used to be a historical marker, one of those metal plaques that dots Florida's landscape, telling snippets of our state's past. This particular marker told the story of Daniel McGirt, a man who terrorized the southern frontier during the Revolutionary War. But sometime in 2020, the marker vanished. No explanation, no replacement, just another mystery in a story already full of them. Maybe it's fitting that McGirt's marker would disappear. After all, this was a man who made an art of vanishing, slipping through prison bars, evading pursuers, fading into the swamps only to emerge where he was least expected. For nearly a decade, he was the most feared name in South Florida, and yet today, few know his tale. When we think of the Revolutionary War, our minds often drift to the northern colonies. Paul Revere's Ride, Valley Forge, the Declaration of Independence. But in Florida, among dense pine forests and sprawling swamps, the war transformed into something darker. This wasn't a conflict of organized armies and formal battles. Here, survival meant breaking every rule, and no one broke them quite like Daniel McGirt. His story reads like a fever dream of the frontier, a loyalist who raided loyalist settlements, a prisoner no jail could hold, a man whose loyalties shifted like sawgrass in the wind. He carved a path of destruction across the southern wilderness, betraying allies and defying capture, until his very name sparked terror in settlements from Georgia to the Florida Keys. Welcome to Mysteries of the Marsh, where we explore Florida's untamed past and uncover the stories that still linger in its swamps and forests. I'm Samantha, an 8th-generation Floridian with a passion for the stories they don't teach in school. The ones that reveal how thin the line between survival and savagery really was. Because that's what this story is really about. In the chaos of revolutionary Florida, Daniel McGirt wasn't just an outlaw. He was a product of his time and place, where the wilderness offered both refuge and peril, and where the only rule was survival at any cost. His actions cast a long shadow over the southern frontier, and like that missing marker in Seminole Park, his true story seems to slip further away with each passing year. So, grab some bug spray and watch your back. In revolutionary Florida, you never knew who might be friend or foe. From 1775 to 1783, Florida was Britain's southernmost stronghold, divided into East and West provinces. In St. Augustine, East Florida's capital, the formidable Castillo de San Marcos stood as an unmistakable symbol of power. Its coquina walls, built by the Spanish in the 1600s, had weathered countless storms and sieges. When Britain took control in 1763, St. Augustine became the heart of crown operations in the south. By the time revolution erupted in the northern colonies, St. Augustine had transformed into something else entirely, a sanctuary for those fleeing patriot persecution. Its narrow streets teemed with loyalist refugees, its squares echoed with drilling soldiers, and the king's officers used the city as a base to launch strikes into Georgia and the Carolinas. But these weren't the orderly battles fought in Europe. The American militias had changed the rules, relying on ambushes and hit-and-run tactics that left British forces reeling. The Crown's response transformed Florida into something unprecedented, a staging ground for swift, brutal campaigns that mirrored the Patriots' own guerrilla tactics. The colony's vast wilderness, its sprawling swamps and dense pine forests, became the perfect cover for raiders and resistance fighters alike. Here, the traditional rules of warfare held no sway. This wild frontier brought together an unlikely alliance of desperate souls. White settlers claimed land grants from the Crown, carving homesteads out of the wilderness. Enslaved people, fleeing south from patriot plantations, traded one uncertainty for another in exchange for promised freedom. The Seminole and Creek peoples saw an opportunity in the chaos and allied with Britain to protect their sovereignty from American expansion. In this crucible of competing interests, yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's enemy as quickly as the tides of Florida turn. It was in this volatile landscape that Daniel McGirt would find his calling. though his path to notoriety began years before the first shots of the Revolution. Born around 1750 in South Carolina's Camden district, McGirt had already made a name for himself as a moderator during the Regulator Rebellion. In this role, he negotiated disputes on the frontier, learning the delicate art of balance between competing interests. This experience, combined with his family's prominent Whig connections, made his eventual turn to the Loyalist cause all the more dramatic. But McGirt's true passion lay in horses. He bred them, raced them, and understood them in a way that made him one of the most respected horsemen in the region. His pride was an iron-gray mare called Grey Goose, a horse that would ultimately change the course of his life. During his service as a Patriot militia scout, this remarkable mare caught the eye of Lieutenant Clark Christie. Christie saw the horse's value and offered McGirt a lieutenant's commission in exchange. When McGirt refused, his love for Grey Goose outweighing any promise of rank, Christie swore he would take the horse by force. The confrontation that followed remains clouded by conflicting accounts. Some say McGirt struck Christie, others claim he merely threatened violence. The result, however, was clear: court-martialed, conviction for striking an officer, and a sentence of public whipping. After enduring 10 lashes, McGirt found himself confined to the local jail, awaiting 2 more rounds of punishment. The humiliation of public whipping, combined with the threat of losing his beloved mare, drove him to desperate measures. Using a broken trowel smuggled to him by what some believed was a sympathetic guard, he worked tirelessly to loosen his cell's window bars. When the moment came, McGirt seized it. Outside his cell, almost as if fate had arranged it, stood Grey Goose. In a scene that would become legend, he mounted his mare and thundered into the night, pausing only to shout defiance at his former comrades before vanishing into the wilderness. Riding south towards East Florida, McGirt carried with him more than just wounded pride. His experience as a moderator had taught him how to navigate between opposing forces, and his skills as a horseman had given him the means to survive on the frontier. Now, these abilities would transform him into something new, something that would haunt the southern colonies for years to come. In St. Augustine, McGirt found his opportunity. The British, desperate to counter the guerrilla tactics that had frustrated their conventional forces, recognized in McGirt something valuable, a man who understood both sides of the conflict and knew how to exploit that knowledge. They offered him a commission in their militia, unaware that they were unleashing a force that would soon spiral beyond their control. The man who had once mediated frontier disputes was about to become one of its most notorious figures. And Florida, with its swamps and shadows, its shifting allegiances and desperate refugees, would prove the perfect stage for his transformation. McGirt's defection from Patriot to East Florida Ranger was a calculated move. In Thomas Brown's Loyalist militia, he found an opportunity to leverage his intimate knowledge of the southern frontier and his tactical skills. Brown, who had been brutally attacked by Patriots in a tarring and feathering incident, was building a guerrilla force designed to strike at the heart of Patriot-controlled territories. Georgia was the linchpin of the southern frontier, a treasure trove of resources and strategic significance that made it an irresistible target for the Loyalist forces. Despite its sparse population, the colony was rich with plantation agriculture, critical supply routes, and key economic infrastructure that could cripple the Patriot war effort if successfully disrupted. Vast cotton and rice fields, sprawling plantations, and essential supply depots dotted the landscape, each a potential source of provisions, weapons, and economic strain for the Patriots. For Brown's Rangers, the psychological impact was equally important. These raids were more than military strategy. They were a form of terror designed to break the spirit of resistance. By systematically targeting the economic lifelines of Georgia's settlements, they hoped to demonstrate the futility of the Patriot cause. Each burned field and destroyed homestead sent a message that no one was safe, no territory was secure. Operating from St. Augustine and strategic outposts along the St. Mary's River, the Rangers developed a sophisticated approach to frontier warfare that exploited the region's complex territorial dynamics. Brown's most critical alliance was with the Creek and Seminole tribes, who had their own motivations for opposing Patriot expansion. These indigenous warriors brought local knowledge and a deep-seated desire to protect their lands, creating a formidable fighting force. McGirt's first major mission with the Rangers demonstrated the effectiveness of their brutal strategy. In early 1778, he led an assault on Colonel John Baker's militia near the Altamaha River. The attack caught the Patriots completely unprepared. McGirt's forces quickly routed the militia, forcing survivors to flee into the surrounding swamps. They seized supplies and captured prisoners, whom they then handed over to their Creek allies. As Zachary Brown documents in The Rhetoric and Practice of Scalping, scalping and mutilation were employed during the Revolutionary War as acts of psychological warfare. These tactics were used to instill fear in enemy communities and demoralize opposing forces. While the article emphasizes the broader use of such practices by various factions, including Creek allies, it highlights how these acts served as grisly warnings and spread terror across the frontier, making warfare a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The raid became legendary among frontier fighters. McGirt's tactics went beyond simple military engagement. They were designed to demoralize and terrorize. In one notable attack, he targeted a Patriot supply train with surgical precision. As the wagons burned and provisions turned to ash, McGirt shouted, "This is what rebellion earns you." In Burke County, McGirt's campaign reached new levels of destructive efficiency. He burned the home of Patriot leader Roger Lawson and systematically devastated the surrounding countryside. Entire communities were displaced, fields reduced to scorched earth. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned strikes intended to undermine the Patriot war effort. And no one felt this more acutely than Colonel John Twiggs. Twiggs was a militia colonel from Georgia's backcountry, responsible for defending Patriot settlements against Loyalist raids. During one of McGirt's raids, he attacked Twiggs's plantation, crushing Mrs. Twiggs' finger while attempting to forcibly remove a ring, a brutal act that transformed their conflict. Twiggs became determined to hunt down McGirt, pursuing him relentlessly across the southern frontier. But McGirt's intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed him to evade capture time and again, moving through dense forests and swamps with remarkable skill. The relationship between McGirt and Thomas Brown was also becoming increasingly strained. Brown valued McGirt's expertise and his ability to execute devastating raids, but grew concerned about his growing independence and personal ambition. McGirt's actions often pushed beyond the boundaries of traditional military strategy, pursuing personal vendettas and seizing spoils for himself and his men. Some Loyalist leaders started to question whether McGirt was more of a risk than an asset, worried that his unpredictable tactics could compromise their broader strategic objectives. By 1778, McGirt's raiding parties had become a permanent feature of the Georgia frontier, appearing from Florida's swamps to strike Patriot settlements with devastating precision. When his forces descended on the Midway settlement near Savannah, they moved like a well-oiled machine, systematically plundering plantations, seizing livestock, goods, and enslaved individuals. The once thriving community, known for its Patriot leanings, emptied as terrified residents vanished into the surrounding wilderness. An assault on Moses Way's fortified homestead showcased McGirt's cold calculation. After capturing Way's young son, the raiders attempted to leverage the boy's life for the stockade's surrender. The standoff stretched from sunrise to sunset, breaking only when Patriot reinforcements appeared on the horizon. Even in retreat, McGirt's men left their signature: burning homes, destroyed crops, scattered livestock, a clear message to those who might resist. His influence stretched deep into East Florida, where he orchestrated a masterful deception at the Cowford settlement. Posing as friendly militia, McGirt's men seized a massive stockpile of cattle and provisions meant for Continental forces. The raid dealt a stinging blow to Patriot supply lines along the St. Johns River. Survivors spoke of more than just material losses. McGirt's men left behind smoldering ruins and warnings carved into trees. transforming the frontier into a landscape of fear. For settlers on both sides of this contested territory, the war had become a constant shadow, and McGirt's raids served as a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes could change in this untamed landscape. But then, McGirt's raids stopped. The frontier fell quiet. No burned homesteads, no stolen livestock, no warnings carved into trees. The man who had terrorized Georgia's settlements had seemingly vanished into the swamps he knew so well. The truth was far more intriguing. McGirt hadn't fled or fallen in battle. He was sitting in a cell in the Castillo de San Marcos, imprisoned by the very British forces he had chosen over his own countrymen years before. The most effective raider on the southern frontier, the man who had betrayed everything to serve the crown, was now considered too dangerous to remain free. British records of the period are maddeningly vague about what triggered this dramatic reversal. Some suggest he'd grown too independent, others hint at conflicts with his superiors, but the greatest mystery lies in what happened next. The official narrative claims the British released him, pardoned him. But why would they free a man they had deemed dangerous enough to lock in their strongest fortress? The same walls that had held Spanish Florida's most dangerous prisoners. And if they had released him, what could explain the vengeful fury he would soon unleash on his former allies? When McGirt reappeared on the frontier, everything had changed. The East Florida Rangers had been reorganized into the King's Rangers, absorbed into the formal British infantry. But McGirt gathered his own force, the Florida Scout, and unleashed a campaign that struck with indiscriminate fury. His raids, once precisely targeted at Patriot settlements, now descended upon Loyalist plantations with equal ferocity. British supply convoys vanished, Loyalist homesteads burned. His alliances with Creek and Seminole warriors remained intact, allowing him to strike deep into settled territories and vanish into Florida's wilderness before retaliation could arrive. These partnerships, always more practical than political, proved invaluable now that both British and Patriot forces hunted him. One Patriot journal described his band as a large body of the most infamous banditti and horse thieves that perhaps ever were collected together anywhere. The Florida Scouts' reputation grew so notorious that long after the war, white men who lived like Indians on the frontier would still be called by that name. McGirt's targets were chosen with calculated precision. Patriot leaders like James McKay controlled vital supply lines and commanded local militias, making them valuable marks for a raider seeking both resources and psychological impact. In one brutal raid near Savannah, McGirt's men ambushed a supply convoy, torturing prisoners for information. When they failed to capture McKay himself, they turned their attention to his wife, crushing her thumb with a musket lock. But such brutality was no longer reserved for Patriots alone. Loyalist plantations reported being laid waste and robbed of all of their valuables, livestock, silver plate, provisions, even slaves. The very people who had once welcomed his protection now fled at the mention of his approach. Rumors spread that he had accumulated wealth amounting to his weight in gold, perhaps planning to abandon the war entirely and settle in West Florida. But McGirt had made too many enemies for such a simple exit. By 1783, when the Treaty of Paris officially ended the Revolutionary War, the Florida Scout had become synonymous with the chaos that gripped the frontier. As Florida transitioned to Spanish control, the new governor, Vincent Manuel de Cepeda, faced a territory in chaos. Among the many challenges of restoring order to the war-torn colony, one name stood out: Daniel McGirt. His raids had grown more destructive since his release from British custody, and now he terrorized the frontier with impunity. The governor labeled McGirt as the ostensible chief of the highwaymen of the country, and the banditti as the abundance of evildoers, both open and undercover. When Spanish forces finally captured McGirt, Cepeda faced a dilemma. The Castillo de San Marcos seemed the obvious choice for such a dangerous prisoner, but the British experience gave him pause. If McGirt had indeed escaped those fortress walls once before, imprisonment might prove temporary at best. Even with the Castillo's reputation as nearly escape-proof, the risk was too great. The Petties opted for a different solution: exile. McGirt was deported to the Bahamas with strict orders never to set foot in Florida again. The Spanish hoped that putting an ocean between McGirt and his hunting grounds would accomplish what prison walls could not. Not one to let exile deter him, he returned to Florida within months. Using his unparalleled knowledge of the region's swamps and wilderness, McGirt resumed his raids, stealing livestock, provisions, and enslaved individuals while evading capture. His knack for slipping through enemy lines made him a constant thorn in the side of the authorities. Eventually, the Spanish caught up with him once more, this time determined to put an end to his escapades. Still wary of keeping him locked up, they exiled him to the Bahamas for a second time, hoping this time he would take the hint. Like a bad penny, he resurfaced in Florida yet again, brazenly continuing his raids as if nothing had happened. By now, his pattern of capture, exile, and return was almost farcical. Captured once more by the frustrated Spanish authorities, McGirt was sent back to the Bahamas. For those keeping track at home, yes, this is the third time he has been exiled from Florida. This final exile was accompanied by increased efforts to monitor Florida's coastline, ensuring he could no longer slip back undetected. This time, with the coastline heavily patrolled and his movements closely watched, McGirt, ever defiant and unwilling to accept banishment, relocated to South Carolina instead, ultimately settling back on his family's property. While whispers of his illicit activities occasionally surfaced, they were minor compared to his earlier exploits. By the late 1790s, McGirt had faded into relative obscurity, spending his remaining years far from the swamps, raids, and battles that had once defined his life. Here, he quietly lived out his days. In 1804, McGirt's story came to a quiet close. The man who had dominated the southern frontier spheres for so long, who had escaped the inescapable Castillo, who had forced the Spanish to exile him not once but 3 times, died in his bed, far from the Florida swamps where he had made his legend. Perhaps there was no more fitting end for a man who had spent his life defying expectations, to slip away quietly, leaving behind more questions than answers. Daniel McGirt's life offers a fascinating glimpse into the volatile history of Florida during the Revolutionary War and its aftermath. His actions as both a patriot turned loyalist and later as a rogue outlaw underscore the region's lawlessness and strategic importance. Florida, a sparsely populated frontier at the time, was a unique theater of the war, a refuge for loyalists and a battleground for supply lines, and a haven for opportunists like McGirt. His alliances with the Creek and Seminole tribes also reflect the complex dynamics between Native Americans and the colonial powers. By leveraging these alliances, he not only advanced his personal vendettas, but also showcased the fluid loyalties of the time. His raids on both patriot and loyalist targets illustrate how survival often took precedence over ideology. Like the historical marker that once stood in Jacksonville, much of McGirt's true story has slipped away into the shadows of history. He left his mark not just in recorded battles and raids, but in the very character of frontier Florida, a place where identities could shift overnight, where today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy, and where even the most notorious figures could vanish without a trace. Just as McGirt mastered the art of disappearing during his lifetime, the full scope of his story continues to evade us. While not a hero by any stretch, Daniel McGirt's story is an essential part of Florida's past, and like that missing marker, the truth of his tale continues to elude us, vanishing like a scout into the swamps of history. Want to dive deeper into Florida's untamed past? Follow us on Instagram at Mysteries of the Marsh for historical photos, newspaper clippings, and other artifacts from each episode. You'll get a behind-the-scenes look at the real people and places we discuss, plus updates on new episodes dropping every Saturday. Until next time, stay curious, and seriously, don't feed the gators.